Hello and welcome to the Allison Supply Chains podcast. This is the May 2025 episode covering the latest news concerning third-party cyber risk management and digital supply chain risk. Each month, we pick a few of the industry's most interesting stories and discuss them. If you like what you hear, or if you prefer to read over listening, you can also find these stories in print form. You can join over 14,000 other readers by subscribing to the Allison Supply Chains newsletter over on LinkedIn today. All right, let's get the show started. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, Principal Researcher of the Defenders Initiative. And joining me, as always, is Alexandre Sieira, the CTO and co-founder of Tenchi Security. How are you doing, Alexandre?
I'm fine. I'm glad to be back home after RSA conference.
Yeah, I immediately had B-Sides Knoxville to contend with the Friday after RSA week. So that was... I had 2 weeks back-to-back that were just crazy.
And not just attending it either, because if people listening don't know, you're the main organizer, as far as I know, of the event. So a lot of work involved. I can appreciate the amount of work involved in putting together an event like this.
I've been trying to reduce my role. I've been trying to prepare them for my inevitable departure. So I would not call myself the main person. James is now the main person over there. So I'm very thankful for that. It went very smoothly, and yeah, it was another good conference. We got about 430 people this year. It's great. All right, so it's time for the vibe check, and the vibe check is the 2025 RSA conference. It's always, or I guess it's RSAC conference, so the C stands for community now, because RSAC does more than just a conference. So they thought, well, what are we going to call these? How are we going to brand all these other things that we do? So RSAC, the C used to stand for conference. Now it's community because there's RSAC webinars. There's all kinds of other things they do that are beyond just events, since they're a standalone company now.
They're actually selling a subscription for you to be part of the community. How interesting is that?
I saw that. I don't know any details. Do you know any details about the subscription? What do you get for that?
You get like year-round additional content. They've always had webinars, but they were sponsored webinars. I'm assuming they're going to have more content-focused webinars around the year that you can watch only if you're a member of the community, right? And the thing I want to say as well is that even though it's RSAC conference week, I cannot forget to mention B-Sides San Francisco, which is one of my favorite conferences anywhere in the world, where I meet lots of interesting people. We actually met in person in San Francisco, and we forgot to take a picture to include in the podcast, which we should have.
We should have.
And we had our good friend Wade Nather keynoting. We had lots of amazing people there, Ross Heideluyek, Clint Gibbler, lots of people that we bump into every year. And if you don't take advantage of your trip to San Francisco for a RSA to also attend besides San Francisco, you're missing out. You should definitely go.
I've been to a lot of B-Sides events, and I've run one for 11 years, and I don't lightly say that I think that is one of the best run B-Sides, if not the best run B-Sides that I have experienced personally.
Yeah. As far as RSA, the things I want to pick out is, of course, AI, and more AI.
Yep. And third year in a row, just all AI. Oops, all AI.
Yep. And interesting to see that essentially all the third-party risk management vendors, everything they're talking about is, instead of trying to get something that is better than questionnaires, because we know questionnaires don't actually work, it's how do I use AI to pretend like questionnaires work, just make them more automated.
It's just bandages.
More error prone. Like, let's automate the stuff that doesn't work, essentially, was the overall message that I got from most of the vendors this year. So I don't know if something else about AI caught your eye.
Let the bleeding continue. We'll just wipe it away with AI.
Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed because I did target some of those vendors when I walked through the. It's funny. One of those vendors, I won't name names, but one of them said, "There's a lot of Brazilians here this year." I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting comment." Apparently somebody was here before me. Maybe somebody from Tenchi.
So actually, fun fact, the number two nationality that attends RSA, they had the stat during the keynote this year, is Brazil.
No
So
way.
yes,
Really?
second most, the biggest contingent for any country is from Brazil in RSA. Yeah,
Well, that's a cool stat. I would not have guessed. I would have guessed maybe Israel or the UK. Yeah, I guess Brazil is usually up there. Yeah, yeah, that's a cool statistic.
and the other thing I want to mention, not RSA related, I'm really gonna control myself and not mention the animals and booths thing, which I happened like first time I ever saw it, and I hope it's the last one. And I know the vendors tried to do it
People
respectfully.
loved it. It won't be the last. It's going to be a barn. It's going to be a barnyard. It's going to be a whole farm next year. There's going to be cows,
That's not
camels.
that's not good for the animals, and I just hope it goes away. Again, I also hope information security problems goes away. So I'm a hopeless optimist. But the last thing I wanted to say is Tenchi Security has been named a representative vendor in the Gartner 2025 Market Guide for Third-Party Risk Management Technology Solutions. So that just happened last week as we're recording this. So right after RSA, so that was a beautiful gift. A lot of hard work went into the product and into our analyst relations to make that happen. So we're super happy about that. Gartner doesn't have a magic quadrant for third-party risk
Mm-hmm.
management solutions, so that's the best we get. It's a market guide.
So it's like a step up from a cool vendor, right? Like representative, like they're actually putting you in a market guide. A cool vendor is more like we recognize they exist. It's typically like really early stage stuff, maybe.
So cool vendor is more like an internal vote among Gartner analysts
Right.
about very small selection of companies that they feel, regardless of market penetration
Okay.
or feature completeness, that they just think are cool, like are doing something different and disruptive. Like we won with the previous startup, we won a cool vendor award in 2016. So that's how that happens. Whereas Market Guide is the precursor for a Magic Quadrant. So Magic Quadrant is typically for more mature markets where you have lots of players that are in multiple geographies. They have a particular minimum size that needs to be reached. And before the market is formalized in that way, they typically do market guides, which are easier to do, and they don't require as deep an amount of research from the analyst about each vendor. They rely a lot more on self-reporting. They do have what they do is, however, they select out of all the companies they talk to which vendors they feel are representative somehow, either of a particular geography or a particular feature set. And so you have like over 70 companies on the market guide, whereas in a typical Magic Quadrant, you would have like maybe 10, 12, right?
Mm,
And so that's the difference. They're casting a wider net, doing
gotcha.
1 inch deep, 1 mile wide analysis on a market guide, whereas in the Magic Quadrant, more mature market, probably a few winners, they're focusing on those winners, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of categories within that, I imagine as well. So
Yeah.
possibly, something I've been doing some research in this area and finding sometimes 3, 4 different vendors that you would all put in this category used at the same time for different things in
Yeah,
companies.
for legal, for financial risk management, for cyber risk management. So there are a lot of subcategories, and some companies are specialized in just orchestrating and then connecting
Yeah.
two-point vendors on each subcategory. So that's interesting. Gartner calls this risk domains in their report.
Yeah.
If you're gonna read it.
All right. Well, let's jump into our first story here. Yeah, let's, and we are going to go through this in order, correct? Or did you want to mix it up a little bit?
So
Okay.
this is a huge issue we're going to have, folks. There's so much to talk about. So let's go through story number one quickly because we need to really dig deep on stories number two and three here.
Yeah. So companies in the EU are starting to look for ways to ditch U.S. cloud companies from Matt Burgess. I guess is that how you would pronounce that? And that's over at Wired. And it's I have had these conversations already. So this is not just people blowing smoke, getting angry and yelling and like for years growing up. Every election, people would be like, "I'm moving into Canada," and nobody would actually do it. These are. I'm actively having discussions with companies who are for new business actively looking for ways to not do business with a U.S. company, not just U.S. company like AWS in a European region, but avoiding AWS altogether because they're worried about U.S. government's access to their data, period, because it's a U.S. company. And then for existing relationships, like I think that's more of a like if we have time, we'll get to that. We'll cross that bridge. To me, so far, it's not looking like across the company we're just going to rip and replace for non-U.S. companies, but definitely for new purchases, I'm seeing this.
And I think one of the things that's mentioned in the story, and I forget the name of the legislation, that we've known for years that a few countries have laws that require companies that are headquartered in that country to cooperate with the government secretly under a certain subset of conditions. Like China famously has that on the legislation, Australia has that, and the U.S. is like considering legislation along those lines. So given the current climate of that geopolitical situation between the U.S. and Europe, and the fact that legislation around this appears to be being considered, I think the urgency is there. I agree with you. It's way too early to know if this will actually happen or not. And if it does, it's going to be long, hard, and expensive. Right? So U.S. companies have a lot to lose, but actually the EU also has a lot to lose, or at least they're going to have to invest a lot and do it really wisely. Like here in Brazil, we had during many years, over a decade, we had what we called reserva de mercado, like a reserved market, like our IT. The government was trying to force our own IT companies to do their own thing and do their own research and produce their own hardware and software. This is back, I don't know, 80s. And we just didn't have.
Not just IT either, right? Like the economy in general, you'll notice when you go to Brazil, Chevy and Volkswagen, they're not the same model names. Like they're different model names. They're built there. It was very important for Brazil to have manufacturing occur there within the country.
I remember the president that's allowed, for example, cars to be imported, and all the cars had to be manufactured locally, which means we had a much smaller selection of models. The models were way worse because they had to source materials locally. So it was horrible for consumers, essentially. And that's the danger here. Like you would want to do something slow and gradual, where you're incentivizing and prioritizing purchasing from local companies, if you are the EU governments, to incentivize those companies existing. But the chance that you'll create something that's, if you protect them too much, that those companies won't be competitive, and that has cascading effects on the SaaS companies that built on top of those cloud providers, say, or the other business they're relying on them, they're going to be less competitive because they're using less competitive vendors, right? So that could have a cascading effect that makes the EU less competitive. And actually, the reason why most of the technology companies are from the US and not EU is because the EU is not competitive enough. They have lots of red tape. They have labor legislation that is much more strict than the US is. There's a famous report called the Draghi report on EU competitiveness. It comes to mind, like from Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank. So it's not just about tackling the technology problem. You would need to create an environment where competitive alternatives to the US companies can exist. And that's a tall order, right? Having said that, again, as TPCRM analysts, I agree that the EU should be thinking about this, given the current scenario. And to be frank, from someone that is from a third country there, it's neither in the US or in the EU, having more options would be awesome, right? So I hope this happens in a controlled and well-executed way. It will give everyone in the rest of the world more alternatives.
I think that red tape can help as well, because I think one of the things lacking in the market are companies you would want to do business with, right? Like because the U.S. has kind of had a stranglehold on the internet, a lot of tech, a lot of stuff. There's a lot of, depending on how you look at it, single points of failure here in the U.S. for the IT and tech economy. One of those things missing are companies that are not playing it fast and loose with your data, that are not selling it to third parties, that are not, growing fast and breaking things, right? So I see that, those alternatives are not only going to be direct alternatives. In some ways, depending on what you prioritize, they could be better alternatives than what's available today.
And we're going to get back to this because the economic incentives are geared against companies doing that, right? When we get to story number 3, we're going to talk about this in depth. So I'm going to shut up because we have.
Yeah. No, let's jump on to story 2 here. I think 3 is the one where we might just get lost altogether and not come back. But story 2, insights from the 58-page ICO investigation report on the 2022 NHS breach. So this is the UK. The NHS is the National Health Service, I believe. And ICO, I don't have that acronym ready. But I assume that's investigative board or audit board that's part of the government.
It's one of the country authorities that kind of implement the GDPR, and I forget what the acronym. It's something office.
I'll find it while you talk about it.
Yeah, and it's not initial coin offering, which is what the Google is right now. It's not crypto stuff, but
Information Commissioner's Office.
Yes. So it's the entity in the UK that investigates and enforces the GDPR, or their privacy legislation, now that they've left the EU. And so that's what they were doing. They were looking into the privacy aspects of the impact of that breach, because if I recall correctly, there were like patient data was potentially implicated, and so they had to look into this.
Yeah, so this is, it went into a lot of gaps. And I think a lot of these gaps are things that, especially in third-party cyber risk management, we see a lot, which is miscommunication about where my responsibility ends and yours begins. So the fact that they weren't covering all employees, that they weren't, they're just looking at their own environment, not the environment of the organizations that they were supporting. That was one of the big misses here, because nobody was doing that, right? When you make these assumptions based off of some kind of shared responsibility model, whether it's a third-party vendor or between the government and things that the government is supposed to be doing, or at least that's everybody's understanding, right? That's why the ICO came down so hard here, is to reinforce that, hey, this is your responsibility. You were supposed to be doing this. You were not doing this. And this is a big slap on the hand of NHS.
And the way this helped, by the way, to make it explicit why we're discussing, is there was a company called Advanced, which is a rather funny name, if you ask me. Apparently the security was not as advanced. Sorry about that. But so they were breached, and they were providing essential services for the NHS, and the fact that they went offline, again, had a cascading or indirect ransomware effect, to quote the cyber insurance report we talked about last issue, and impacted the NHS indirectly. So that's why we're talking about this. This is a third-party event. And that third party is something that Mr. Kevin Beaumont, I hope that I'm pronouncing that right, very well-known security professional based in the UK, raised, that I thought was interesting. This vendor, this advanced company, had the Cyber Essentials Plus certification. Among many other certifications, they had SOC 2s, they had the works, right? And so the Cyber Essentials Plus certification, right? I went and looked into that. It's a UK-specific certification that gives you liability cover if you have revenue under a certain amount, kind of a insurance coverage in case of a cybersecurity event, and it's checking. It's based on a self-assessment questionnaire, and they have 2 levels: the Cyber Essentials.
Never a problem with those. Yeah.
Plus, never, right? So it's a long self-assessment questionnaire, and the responses are reviewed by an assessor. What are they going to review? I don't know. If you fill them all out or something, if the spelling is correct, if you're not auditing anything, what are you even checking for? Only like gross inconsistencies. And then the plus level includes an actual audit based on that questionnaire. And the things they're checking for is user access control, secure configuration, security update management, firewalls and routers, and malware protection. So right off the bat, you see why Kevin raised this, is because They found lack of 2FA, so user access control, but this probably should have been required. And there was exploitation of a very old vulnerability, the zero logon vulnerability, right? That was from 2020, so for a couple of years prior, at least. And the certification covers security update management. So what gives? How were they certified if they were not doing those things? And it's the thing we've been talking about forever here in this podcast, is that people put too much weight into those security certifications. This is not different from SOC 2 or anything else.
It's just like a compliance standard. Like PCI is no different, right? Like it's a baseline. It's not a guarantee.
So actually, PCI, I think, is slightly better, or slightly less bad, because in PCI, at least, the standard defines what the scope is. Something like Plus. In theory, there's an entire document, like the scoping guideline for PCI DSS, that lays out what the ground rules are. If there's cardholder data in that environment, it's in scope. If it has connectivity to the cardholder data, like network connectivity, it's in scope. Or if it can impact the security of the cardholder data environment, it's in scope. So if there's an MSP that operates your firewall, the MSP is in scope. So they're clear. You can't pick and choose what you want. You can lie to the auditor, but here it's not even lying. When you get certified in Cyber Essentials or SOC 2 or ISO 27001, you choose. If you want to just certify your website, you can.
Right.
On the certification that's what you're certified. But this is my point. Did the NHS check? Because one of the things that the ICO report says is that Advanced has stated its corporate IT infrastructure was already accredited for Cyber Essentials Plus pre-incident. However, its advanced health and care environment was not. And that's the one that was really important to protect the NHS. But they still decided to work with this company. Did they rely on the company having the certification? And if they did they check if the scope that was covered by the certification was the one that mattered? So I think that's the lesson here. Even if they did, right? Even if it was certified, we know, and I know that it's super. This is infrequent checking. The audit is done by sampling. There's a lot of fudge space where the audited company can choose the least intrusive auditor, the auditor that's going to be more friendly to them. They can try to mislead about what the actual scope is and can, present the evidence that makes them look the best. There's a lot of things where a lot of wiggle room here, and this goes to story number 4, that people can exploit. But this was even more basic. The relevant environments were not even in scope, right? So this is an actual example about this. Right, so this is something that I wanted to emphasize, because we talk about this a lot. This is an actual example.
Yeah.
And if you look at the website, you're going to say, I'm Cyber Essentials Plus certified, or I'm SOC 2 certified, and people are going to get comfort from this in TPCRM or in the business teams that are looking into this vendor. Oh, they have a security certification. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. They had quality vulnerability management, just not on the environment with the patient data. Right.
But like SOC 2, like you can actually request a SOC 2. You can read the SOC 2. You can see if it's meaningless and if it's narrowed to a scope the size of the head of a pin, or but also with Cyber Essentials Plus, one of the folks in this thread with Kevin Beaumont points out that you can see the scope for Cyber Essentials Plus as well. So that'll be a custom paragraph written by the company stating what that, or I don't know if it's written by them or written by Advanced or the whoever does the audit.
The scope is one of the questions in the self-assessment questionnaire. I checked.
Yeah. But it is exposed to the public. You can go look at it for anyone with Cyber Essentials Plus on registry.blockmarktech.com. It looks like they have all the certificates there for everybody. I don't know if that's the only one used or if that's one of many places where you can publish those details, But yeah, good to know that there's some transparency there. But yeah, like you say, when I was a PCI QSA, I saw all kinds of stuff go on because really the QSA is PCI as far as you're concerned for your company. So if they interpret it wrong, that's the interpretation you got. And your only option is to fire them and replace them. Or on the flip side, if you don't want them to look in this corner over here and pay any attention to the legacy NT4 systems over there that have credit card data on them, you can just keep firing QSAs until you find one that's willing to ignore that corner, right? So, and I did see that happen quite often.
So I feel like that's the lesson here. Like, check what the scope is, check what the controls are that are being selected, because some of those standards allow the audited company to define which controls are going to be inspected. Doesn't seem to be the case here, even though in this standard the controls are not super hard. Like MFA is not mandatory. There's a lot of ways to do IP allow listing, or to have like 12 character passwords so you don't need MFA anymore. Like, what? It's actually on the standard. But overall, I think the message is I would only trust this to be sufficient or even close to sufficient for really low criticality vendors. For high criticality vendors, this is not conveying the assurance that most organizations think it is. Right. So again, I think people need to weigh this down a lot more. They weigh this a lot less than they used to. Give it a lot less credence than they currently has.
Yeah. And just understanding how the whole process works. I would encourage people to look into it, talk to somebody who does the certification process, and understand what that process looks like. So you know where the gaps are, where if something's being closely looked at, or, if it's just a rubber stamp check mark type of operation. Yeah. And finally, £3 million fine to the ICO from NHS. I don't know if that's a motivator, when the government finds itself. I imagine it's just moving from, like, they just leave it in the same place. Like, I don't know if that's as much a motivator as finding a private company, but there was a £3 million fine for that. This episode is brought to you by Zanshin, the innovative SaaS solution for third-party cyber risk management that's disrupting the market with a cooperative, continuous, and comprehensive approach. Zanshin is the first product to allow first parties to gain true visibility into their third parties in a non-intrusive way. Gain a deep understanding of how secure your third parties are in key areas like cloud security, endpoint security, identity and access management, and at-risk encryption. Visit Tenchi at tenchisecurity.com to schedule a demo or free trial and see for yourself how enterprise customers are able to reduce third-party risk by 80% or more in just a few weeks. So, yeah, if you're not sitting down, prepare for this. But we're gonna go from 2022 to 1902 and talk about the Great Hanoi Rat Massacre and modern risk practices and what those two things have in common. Take it away, Alexandre.
So that's from my friend Tony Martin Vague, which is awesome. I remember seeing him in beside San Francisco when I met him initially, when we're talking about lies, dem lies, and information security statistics reports. Look up that talk. It's awesome. But essentially what he's talking about is perverse incentives. So the Hanoi Rat Massacre is in the French colonial management of Hanoi. There was a problem. People were getting sick because there were too many rats in the city. So the government decided to pay people for killing rats. And the way they implemented this was, if you bring me a rat tail, I'm going to pay you X amount of money. And that immediately started creating. So the thinking was, you kill a rat, you just bring the tail, you don't want to bring the whole corpse, and then I pay you for all the rats you've killed. And then people started bringing in rats from outside the city. People started breeding rats just to cut off their tails and get it to the government to be paid more. People started cutting tails and then leaving the rats alive, hoping they would re-grow their tails and maybe they could benefit from that rat again. I don't know. So
gruesome.
It actually worsened the problem. There were more rats, not less, because the things were designed was
they became a source of income.
the economic incentives were aligned in a way that had that created problems, right? Which is precisely one of the biggest problems in information security. You can trace most of our problems to economic incentives, to misaligned economic incentives in the industry. And there's a lot of people like our good friend Fernando Montenegro, Augusto Paes de Barros, and so many others that have been, Kelly Shortridge, that have been talking about this intersection of information security and economics. And this is Martin doing the same thing. And so he points out precisely that. And he shows, again, to the point we just discussed, right? He shows how you can build, he shows like a flywheel. Real cyber risks exist untreated. And then the next step is leadership wants compliance. The next step is consultants build risk programs based on standards like ISO 27001 and CIS, critical security controls, or the SOC 2s and so on and so forth. Next step is consultants audit risk programs. Next step is we get a passing audit, so it's success.
Yay!
Mitigated. So we go back to the beginning.
Job done.
Exist untreated, and we keep on this flywheel spending money.
Yeah, none of it did anything to treat the problem. Yeah.
And the risks are still there, right? And the thing he says here that I think is super relevant to what we just discussed about the certification of that UK provider is compliance standards have flexibility to accommodate any organization. But that same flexibility allows companies to, quote, that same flexibility also, quote, leaves just enough latitude for organizations to build the easiest, cheapest, least rigorous version of a risk management program and still check the box. And that's a fundamental problem with any compliance program. Right? The standards have to be flexible to accommodate companies of all sizes and industries and risk tolerances. And even if you don't take into account that you can pick your auditor, that you can pick your scope, that you can pick the controls you want to implement, even then, you can still have other mechanisms inside those standards to implement the easiest, cheapest, less rigorous version of that program and still pass, right? By design. And the thing I keep telling people is that those compliance frameworks are something like therapy, like psychotherapy. If you do it for your own sake and you really want it to work, it's super valuable. But if you're forced to do it, you can just lie through your teeth, it's going to have no effect. And that's what I think about the frameworks and the audit and certification processes around them. Right? If you're talking to a company that really did it for themselves and they took it seriously, there's value in it. But when you add the economic incentive of, I require you to have this certification before I'll do business with you, people are just going to take the shortcut. And it's not saying what you think it's saying. Right?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah, I remember.
I'm not doing it justice, but go read it. Martin is awesome. The text is awesome.
Yeah, and this is it's an article on LinkedIn. He posted on LinkedIn. Very well written article. Lots of great visuals, and it reminds me a bit. Looking at this cycle, reminds me of an essay that Clifford Stoll wrote back in the 90s, maybe. I forget. It might have even been published in a very early version of Wired. I forget where this essay was published. But he was thinking, as any reasonable person I think would, that the first company have a really bad hacking incident. We didn't call them breaches back then. That word didn't exist yet. Like that would fix it. Like everybody would just straighten up. They'd start doing the right things. And, clearly Clifford being, a engineer, scientist, if he was a student of business, he would have known, better. Right. But yeah, back then from his perspective, just one breach and, wouldn't happen again. Everybody would do, security correctly. And, it turns out doing security correctly is really, really tough now too. More and more the devices are different all over the place. With if you didn't think of BYOD becoming a thing or SaaS becoming a thing. There's so many things you have to changes in technology that's just made the field that much more difficult. Just by steps.
Interesting.
All right.
Segue to number 3.
Yeah. So moving on to story number 3, which a lot of people spotted this, and this spread like wildfire when it got posted. But JPMorgan, I think I don't know where they rank exactly, but one of the largest American banks, published an open letter to third-party suppliers, basically saying shape up or ship out.
I think it was a thing that hit during RSA week, and I didn't get a chance to read it until last week, and it's a gift. It's something that every CISO I think should read, and there's a lot to talk about it, but there's a lot of value in this. So I just wanted to thank Patrick Opet for putting this out. You can see he put a lot of thought into this, and I can only imagine what the process was to get this approved by JPMorgan Chase's PR department and legal counsel or everyone else. We're going to get to why in a minute. But this is clearly well thought out, heartfelt, and has a lot of truth in it. So I love it. I love it to bits. I think this, I hope to see more people talking about this, because we joke that third-party cyber risk management is one of information security's best kept secrets. Things like this are going to make it less of a secret, right? So I don't know if you want to bring up your concerns, because I have a lot of notes.
Yeah. So just, I'll kind of kick you off here and kind of pose I think the natural pushback we're going to see on this, like if so secure by design reminds me a lot of this. Secure by Design was mostly cybersecurity companies that were signing that pledge. It was voluntary, and it pushed for a lot of things. But we even heard Microsoft after that CSRB report came out about Microsoft's breach. I think that was one of the Russian attacks. I don't remember. They've had a lot of breaches in the last couple of years, but it was the one that hit. Or no, it was China, I believe, because they were targeting Microsoft 365 accounts belonging to organizations who were helping to form Chinese policy, and those are the folks targeted by that. But yeah, we hear a lot of this, a lot about prioritizing security over rushing features, and I mean, as long as there's a competitive market and your competition's going to get there faster, I don't know how you make secure by design work. Like the example I love to use, because nobody knows how many breaches Dropbox has had, and I would say Dropbox is a mature, successful company. I give them a couple $100 every year, easy place to archive and store my stuff. And they have like a nice, like, Microsoft Office, SaaS equivalent Office built into it. They have a lot of nice features. They've had at least 7 breaches, and they're fine, right? Back to that Clifford Stoll thing. It turns out companies can have breaches, and it's not a business-ending event. So without regulation, I guess this is one of those other things. Like if other banks put some teeth to this, if they enforce this philosophy, maybe we could see a change. But I can't think of another case where we saw the industry address and solve this problem. I mean, PCI is an example where they said, wait, don't regulate us. We'll do this ourselves. But I would argue PCI didn't actually make anybody more secure. It sold a lot of products, sold a lot of SIMs. SIMs did very well after PCI came out. But yeah, so just queuing up for you. That's what's going through my head as I read this. How do you turn this into reality?
So PCI DSS, I think, did a lot of work for retail companies that have had very little security, at least the retail companies I had contact with, and it forced them to have like the bare minimum, which is nowhere near enough. Companies, some of those large retailers, but they have such thin margins that if you don't give them, like, if they don't make it mandatory, they're not going to do it. And
Yeah.
that actually goes back to my first point on the letter here. So I agree with everything you said. And again, we go back to the point of economic incentives. So the two first things that caught my attention on the letter here is that software providers must prioritize security over rushing features. And then that organizations have little choice but to rely heavily on a small set of leading service providers, embedding concentration risk into global critical infrastructure. He's talking about two very economic incentive related things here, right? That I don't think we're going to change unless we change the economic incentives somehow, right? And I don't purport to know the answer, but and I want to recommend our good friend Fernando Montenegro's talk in 2016 at B-Sides Rochester. It's still timely. I mean, his references to the success of Splunk maybe haven't aged that well, but other than that, like all the economic concepts are great. And the one thing he mentions is software in general has high fixed costs but low marginal costs. So it takes a lot of investment to create the software initially, but each additional sale, you don't spend a lot. So it's hugely prone to monopolies and thus to market concentrations. So it's what he says. We are relying on a small number of monopolies or oligopolies, like Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace, or AWS, Azure, and GCP. We have this small, tiny number of companies. And if any of them is owned like thoroughly, the entire economy is screwed. That's intrinsic to the way that economics of software and of SaaS, by consequence, software as a service, works.
Yeah. And that's not just an IT thing, right? Concentration risk is a very broad concept.
It will happen on many industries for a variety of reasons. In the case of software, it's particularly common because of that, because it is initial investment, which actually creates barriers for entry for new entrants, right? But once you're over that hurdle of the initial fixed cost of developing the software that works, selling additional copies of that software doesn't cost almost anything, right? So you have a huge incentive to actually to be the first mover, to occupy the space, to launch features, to become attractive, to cut prices initially, and attract as many customers as possible. Because once you occupy the space and you grab that revenue for yourself, you keep getting further ahead from any new entrants, from any would-be competitors, right? So that incentivizes building features over doing things properly, the move fast, break things, and it also creates the concentration. So there is no solution that information security can provide alone, that technical solution to those two problems. It's an economic problem. So either it has to be buyers, and I mean like the business teams that decide which SaaS offerings to buy, applying economic pressure, saying, I'm not going to buy from you unless you do this, this, and that, or regulation, as you said, that's going to move the leader. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I want to point out here for economic reasons is that the huge economic incentive for attackers to use third parties as force multipliers, right? So you hack one, you compromise many. So it's a time saver. It's an investment saver. It increases the ROI of an attacker. Like if someone hacks into a big IDP, how much privileged access will they get to hundreds or thousands of companies, right? So it might be a lot, 4 times, 10 times as much effort to hack a company like Ping Identity, Okta, Jump Cloud, whoever they are. Not saying that any of those companies, not evaluating how secure they are.
Right.
I'm assuming they're all super secure companies. But if they were to be hacked, even if it was 10 times, 100 times more difficult than hacking a normal company, the upside for attackers here is they get access to thousands of companies. So the economics starts making a lot of sense. And that's where, again, economic solutions, trust busting, like preventing market concentration was a typical thing that governments have to do. And you could say most of those companies are in the US, so we're particularly reliant globally on the US government doing this, right? And doing antitrust work. I'm going to not comment whether the US government has been doing that well or not, but We see a lot of monopolies in the software market. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. And the other thing I want to say, and I want to commend him on, and I feel in my bones how much work he has probably went through to get this approved and published, because of the following paragraph. At JPMorgan Chase, we've seen the warning signs firsthand. Over the past 3 years, our third-party providers experienced a number of incidents within their environments, and those incidents across our supply chains required us to act swiftly and decisively, including isolating certain compromised providers and dedicating substantial resources to threat mitigation. He didn't outright say it, but he might as well have said it. We were impacted by incidents at our third parties.
Yeah.
And that's not something that a huge bank will admit to unless they are forced, like a SEC 8K or other compliance regulation requiring them to do that. I love to see it. It's super brave, and we need to normalize this. Again, people need to understand, if this is happening to one of the 1%ers in information security, because who here has any doubt that JPMorgan Chase probably is one of the most secure companies in the planet, right? Given the budgets they have, the talent they have, the compliance requirements they're under, right? They absolutely are. And they are still seeing this problem enough to go public about this. So just kudos to them for doing this. Again, this is incredible, right? And then he makes the point. I don't know if you've have any additional comments here, because I can just go on. I have.
Yeah. So something I was going to point out is, the importance of prioritizing your third parties that this places, because it's, I'm sure JPMorgan Chase has tens of thousands of third parties, of suppliers, if not over 100,000. And yeah, you can't put this level of scrutiny on all of them. And often when these supply chain attacks occur, I find I've never heard of these companies. I had no idea these companies were, that important or like critically important to healthcare, to all these different industries. And yet we need a good process for going through, and maybe one already exists. And, just because I haven't spent a lot of time in third-party risk management, maybe I'm not aware of them, but we've got to make that short list. These are the companies that we really want to focus on very closely, and if they're not up to, and then determine what that bar looks like, we're going to go shopping somewhere else. How do you decide that somebody is secure enough, with the amount of visibility you have into them? I don't know if you know anything about this, but that's just my thought.
Every security team.
I don't know if you built a company or anything based on it. Yeah.
Well, I might have heard a thing or two from a few bank CISOs that are good friends. But you know how every information security team has access to an up-to-date and complete asset inventory? So every TPCRM team has access to an up-to-date and complete, vendor inventory that's prioritized by risk, and they know exactly which critical information is shared with each one of them, which critical processes are supported by each one of them. The same way.
In their dreams. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're hitting the nail on the head here. That's an important point. Another thing that he mentions, right, that is super interesting, is particularly concerned about SaaS, right, and the switch from the on-prem security model to SaaS, right? And I have a few thoughts on this. So he mentions that on-prem security practices enforced strict segmentation between a firm's trusted internal resources and untrusted external interactions using protocol termination, tiered access, and logical isolation, end quote. At JPMorgan Chase, for sure, but how many other companies did that consistently and successfully? Adrian, mm-hmm. Right? Again, as to our point about asset inventories and vendor inventories, right? Not a lot of companies actually pulled off implementing a proper on-prem security model. I understand JPMorgan Chase saying, "Hey, we finally nailed it we had something good we were working with it, and then here comes SaaS and disrupts the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I get it. That's not the reality for 99% of the market. I feel that if you pick the right SaaS vendors, for most companies out there, using a good SaaS vendor is a net security increase, not decrease, because people were failing miserably at implementing on-prem security because it's much more complex, it's much more up to
Yeah.
you, and everyone has the team or the budget and the regulations and the leadership support to make the hard decisions that you need to make the on-prem security model work. And SaaS security is not perfect, but letting AWS do patching for you, as for example, when you run servers.
Certainly makes zero trust easier, right?
Yes. So there's this opportunity for security gains using SaaS that I understand from his point of view is not there because he's very, very unique in the position of being one of the most secure companies in the world. But for the rest of us, I think we need to take that point with a grain of salt, a little bit, right? But he did correctly identify that IAM or authentication authorization is now the new perimeter, and not all cloud services, not even some of the biggest ones, do a good enough job of allowing customers, giving customers the granularity they need in authorization, giving customers all the functionality they need. We talk about the SSO tags, for example. We remember that the Snowflake incidents began with the fact that Snowflake didn't allow a customer to enforce 2FA across their tenant. That's a failure of the vendor.
Yeah.
Having said that, even when the cloud provider does provide the features, you see a vast majority of customers not using them. Is it because
maybe they don't even know it's there, right? Yeah, that's one of the things about SaaS is stuff will get added. Like Notion, the beginning of the time when I used Notion, it was just something you put notes into. And, today it offered to record a meeting and transcribe it for me. So now it's hooking into my audio video, connecting to my meetings. It's got AI built into it. It's just keeping up. Again, you've got 10,000 SaaS tools. How are you keeping up? Like AI governance is something I talk about often with companies. How do you keep up with which of them have added some kind of generative AI model to it and which ones haven't? It's very difficult. There's no common bus, that they send that information across, unless it's email, right? Except maybe you get an email update for them, and that's not really sent in a standardized format, right? Or to the third-party risk folks.
So the thing I will agree with him on is that a lot of SaaS vendors are not doing their part, but I would just say it's not just on them. I want to be fair to third-party vendors as well, right? We try to keep things balanced here. Even when the capabilities are there, like think of public S3 buckets. How long has AWS provided functionality for people to make their S3 buckets not public, or warn them in big letters saying, don't do this, it's going to be public, and people go still do the clicking and make it public, right? But yes, I will agree with him on the granularity thing and the capabilities. He talks about fourth-party or nth-party vendor dependencies. Could not agree more. There is no SaaS bill of materials, right? There's no easy way for you to know which third parties your third parties have, to what are the nth parties, and something that the market is sorely needing. And I don't know what it would take to make that a reality and implement a standard. Cue the XKCD strip about, I have N standards, now I have N+1. And then the thing that I love the most, I'm going to quote again: secure and resilient by design must go beyond slogans. It requires continuous, demonstrable evidence that controls are working effectively, not simply relying on annual compliance checks. Amen to that. This is the fight we've been fighting. No self-assessment questionnaires, no check-in-the-box certifications that you only go look at once a year. A lot of those things are checking if you have the policies, if you have the paperwork, if the controls are designed correctly. not if they are working, not if the configuration settings are actually there, if the patches are actually there, if the 2FA is actually enabled in the environments that matter, right? As you know, and I want to make this into a sales pitch, Felipe and I built an entire company around this concept. Yes, absolutely yes. This is the things that's missing, right? No one would agree on having a critical system that they own and operate on their infrastructure. And the only thing they did security-wise would be to check in once a year, like sending a self-assessment questionnaire to the IT team that manages that system. When you outsource this to a SaaS provider, you can't pretend that that's enough just because it's another company. It's still a critical system to you. It still has access to your critical data. It's still supporting critical processes, right? So you need to have a more similar amount of supervision and control and checking, continuous checking, automated checking that you have for when it's internal. So it's not about not being SaaS. He talks about bring your own cloud, or more vendors need to have bring their own cloud, or need to have on-prem deployment options. There's another option, right? The other option is you actually allow them to run their own cloud, but you get the visibility you need, even though it's their cloud, right? That exists, that is possible, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's an option that hasn't been raised here. Right?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't, I don't think a lot of people are aware. You know, in my conversations at RSA, I think a lot of people consider that like an impossibility, like something that, you know, no one would ever go for. You know, so I think there's some work to do to get the word out that yes, that indeed is an option, and it is possible, and people are doing it.
So send an email to contact@tenchysecurity.com, and we can tell you more. And I'm going to stop it there because this is not a sales pitch.
So before we wrap, I want to go back to prioritization again because, you know, we've seen the industry shift somewhat. You know, we were talking about credit card theft and things like that. Like early on, breaches were all about data theft. And in fact, the Verizon data breach report is broken up into incidents and breaches. And breaches are defined by whether or not data is compromised. There's a confidentiality component. But now with ransomware, we've seen that actually move, and with targeting of third parties, move into disrupting operations. So, you know, I'm curious about how you're seeing third-party risk management teams prioritizing the stuff they're worried about. Because, like, if I'm JPMorgan Chase, I'm going to prioritize somebody can't interact with their money. They can't take it out of an ATM. They can't move it from their bank to another bank. Like immobilizing their access to their funds, like that's, you know, on day 2 there's pitchforks, right? There's angry people, there's mobs and riots over, you know, just my data getting stolen or lost for the 400th time.
It's so I see a combination of 3 things, right? So you have the way that third-party cyber risk management teams get whatever visibility they get onto who the critical vendors are. They typically come on countries that have compliance legislation, right? The privacy teams have already done a lot of work mapping out who the third parties are that they share personal data with, right? As a part of defining the scope and making sure the contracts have the right wording, blah, blah, blah. So it's part of it. List that in the privacy policy who are processors, right? So the third-party cyber risk management teams leverage that. And you could do the same for PCI. Like if you're going to be audited for PCI, you have to do PCI compliance. You need to identify the third parties that you share cardholder data with, or they have a security impact in their cardholder data environment, blah, 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 blah. And there's financial regulation, there's HIPAA. So you can leverage that. So that's the first source. Like compliance-driven scopes can lead you to identify third parties that are critical, because if they have a breach and they leak your data, you're going to have the compliance fine on top of everything else, right, to handle. The second thing would be business impact assessments. When you do disaster recovery planning or continuity, you're going to identify the processes that are more critical, and you're typically going to map internal systems and third parties, that are critical for those processes. And if they go down, then those processes go down. And so that's another source of identification for who your critical third parties are.
Love BIAs. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third thing is what you said, like crown jewels. Regardless of whether we have legislation or if this isn't critical in an availability sense, for example, the formula for Coca-Cola, right? Or the design for the fighter jet, if I'm a defense contractor, right? And this is my IP. So those things typically will also get a lot of attention, and hopefully you're not only checking the internal risks, but also which third parties I'm involving that might have access to that data or to the environment where that data resides, and including that as part of the crown jewels protection. Those are the three sources that I see. It's very rare to have someone go systematically over all the third parties because, as you said, it can be tens of thousands of them, and just do like an exhaustive list of who is critical and who is not.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that's all we got time for this month. I think that was easily our best one yet, Alexandre. I think a good variety of stories, covered some really important stuff. You know, I think JPMorgan Chase and Patrick Opet helped us out here, certainly by sounding that alarm. And if you liked what you heard and you're on a platform where you can like, subscribe, or leave a comment, please do so. We'd love to get your feedback. All right, stay safe and stay vigilant. We'll see you again next month.